Hi, Ken Horst here, your weight loss wingman. And in this video, the history of weight gain and obesity in America and what we can do to reverse the trend, I'm going to share with you some interesting data that I discovered recently when I started my search, if you will, with the question simply, what is the average weight for a man and a woman in the United States? And that led me to asking a follow-up question, which was, please plot the average weight for men and women in the United States over the last, well, it turns out 120 years. So let's jump in and I'll show you how my journey went and the information I found. And ultimately, what I think I got out of this information was what we can do today to actually lose weight and keep it off. And there's a lot of lessons that we can take from the past. So, as I mentioned, this is how my journey started with this quest. It was a question in ChatGPT, and I simply asked, what is the average weight for adult men and women in the United States? And as you can see from this slide, according to, again, they were referring to data from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and one of the latest reports, men were approximately 199.8 pounds, and women were approximately 170.8 pounds. Now, I seem to remember, and maybe it was 40 years ago, that I saw something in an article somewhere that said the average man in America was 5 foot 10 inches high and weighed 165 pounds. And it just so happens that I'm 5'10", and so I always thought that for me, the right weight or the average weight would be about 165. So in the back of my mind, for most of my life, I've kind of thought 165 is a right weight for me. And so when I saw here that the average weight for a man today was 199.8 pounds, or almost 200 pounds, let's call it, I couldn't believe what I was looking at. I mean, like, how did we get so gigantic? And so that's what led me to ask the follow-up question, which was, please plot the average weight for men and women by decade, starting with the year 1900. Because I figured with this graph or chart, I would be able to see, at what point, things started to go the wrong way for all of us. And so here's the graph that I got. And as you can see, looking at, again, from 1900 to 2020, needless to say, the average weight for men and women has gone up, and it's gone up a lot. As a matter of fact, for men back in 1900, men were at about roughly 148, call it 150. So men went from 150 to 200 in 120 years, and women went from about 130 to about 170, which is an increase of 40 pounds. So how did we go from, and even just looking at from 1920 to 2020, in that 100 years, if you will, people in the United States went from being basically right-sized to being oversized. And the question again is, so how did it happen and what can we learn from this? This slide shows you each decade, average weight for men and women, and then some of the key influences that contributed to what the average weight was for men and women for each decade. And this was a lot of information for one slide. So what I decided to do is break this up into smaller pieces of information so it was easier for you to see and easier for us to discuss. So the first slide, I've got 1900 through 1930 on here. And really, men and women did not gain a lot of weight between 1900 and 1930. Men went from 148 roughly to 155, and that is what, 7 pounds or so. And women went from 129 to 134, so that's about 5 pounds. So over 40 years, men and women's weight really didn't go up much. So, the question is, well, what was going on in those 40 years that allowed people to maintain a pretty reasonable weight for men and women? And you can see there's a number of different things here, but I've highlighted some that I think are relatable to today. So if you look at 1900, one of the things I highlighted here was minimal processed food availability. So people back in these early times were eating whole foods and made from scratch meals at home, which is the one I highlighted here in 1910. Meals were still cooked from scratch at home. So people were eating, real food. You look at 1920, the processed food industry was still in its infancy. And so there really weren't a lot of processed food choices. Again, people were eating whole foods. And then in 1930, this was a Great Depression, impacted a lot of things. But one of the things that is true in the 30s, and it was true all the way back to 1910, is high levels of physical activity remained the norm. Back in these years, most men worked either in a factory or on a farm, and it was physical work. There weren't a lot of desk jobs between 1900 and 1930 for men or women. And so a lot of what was going on, you see here in 1900, industrialized society with physically demanding jobs. So in the first 40 years, basically what we can learn is people moved a lot, mostly because of their jobs. Also, they moved a lot because they didn't have cars back then, at least initially. So they moved a lot more and they ate real whole food. Moving on to the next few years, 1940 through 1970. In 1940, again, people were physically active, war-related jobs, but one of the things, again, that kept people, I would argue, more thin back then is limited sugar and fat availability. Again, we were still eating whole foods back in those years. Now, at 1950 and 1960 and 1970, a number of interesting changes happened in these 3 decades that I think really led to the curve going, increasing at an increasing rate. And so in 1950, one of the things that happened was supermarkets, frozen dinners, and processed foods exploded. Supermarkets, frozen dinners, and processed foods exploded. And ultimately, what you may see a lot of today is a lot of people talking about obesity as being caused by ultra processed foods and things like that, which I believe is true. And that all exploded, if you will, in 1950. In 1960, a couple of things that happened. Fast food chains rapidly expanded. Think McDonald's. So before the 60s, there weren't a lot of fast food chains, if you will. You had your local burger joint, and again, more like Whole Foods, right? Real food. But in the 60s, all of a sudden, McDonald's, set the pace, and more fast food chains started to be, explode across the United States. And we all know that the food at a fast food restaurant is generally not that healthy for us. And if you eat it every day, pretty good chance you're obese, right? We know this. This isn't news to us. Now, the other interesting thing in 1960 was television became a major source of entertainment. And so the third bullet point for 1960 is the decline in daily physical activity and home cooking. Decline in home cooking, again, moved us away from cooking with, eating whole foods and starting to eat out more in fast food chains, which is super unfortunate. And then the television made us spend more time sitting on our butt after dinner and watching TV instead of going for a walk or gardening or doing whatever we might do, which would require us to get up and go outside and do something. And then in the 70s, the microwave oven was introduced, and also increasing processed food use. So in the 70s, we talk about processed foods exploded in the 50s, and the microwave oven made it easier to cook these processed foods, so that increased processed food use. Sugar and soda consumption surged in the 70s. Again, another example of things that cause obesity, sugar and soda. And by the way, if you're drinking sugar pop today, like Coke or Mountain Dew or something like that, and you're overweight, and you're gonna go on a diet, I mean, I would say maybe you should wake up and stop drinking sugar pop, because there's nothing good about drinking sugar pop. Unless you're trying to gain weight, then it's probably good, or get diabetes. But this started out in the 70s. I should say it really started to increase a lot in the 70s. And it was really after the 70s, if you will, that again, we saw a pretty big increase in the rate at which the average weight for men and women went up. Now, here we get into 1980, 1990, and 2000. And again, as I mentioned a moment ago, this is referred to as the post-1970s acceleration. And it was characterized by increased availability of ultra processed foods, the foods that are high in sugar, salt, cholesterol, all kinds of things that your doctor probably tells you to try to avoid. You know, if you read any books on weight loss and weight management, same thing. Avoid, sugar, salt, cholesterol, some of these things. And then marketing of low fat, high sugar foods. These are just, again, a collection of things post 1970 that accelerated the average body weight for men and women. But looking at 1980, and again, we went from 181 pounds to 195 pounds in 30 short years here. So that's a pretty big leap when you look back at the first 40 years, and we barely went up like 6 pounds. Again, popularity of diet sodas and artificial sweeteners, desk jobs and sedentary lifestyles are widespread. So in the 80s, even more people had desk jobs, and fewer people were, getting movement from their job. So more people were sitting on their butt for longer, which makes us get bigger. In 1990, I highlighted all 3 of these items here. Number 1 was low-fat, high-carb diets dominated, and they referred to it as the Snackwell effect. And the Snackwell effect is a phenomenon where people would consume more of a food product labeled as healthy or low fat than they would if the product wasn't labeled healthy or low fat. And often this resulted in them consuming more calories, which ultimately led to obesity. So they thought they were doing good because they were eating healthy food, at least according to the label. And so they were eating more of it, but without thinking about it, they're still consuming more calories. And this led to what they've thought of as a moral license encouraging overconsumption. And so that, hence the Snackwell effect, if you will. Supersizing and restaurant dining became mainstream. And remember, in the first 40 years, we talked about people ate dinner at home. And so when you eat at home, you eat whole foods, typically. I mean, you can eat ultra processed foods as well. But I mean, back in the early years, I mean, people were eating real food and preparing at home. And then the third one here, which is really, I think, one that everybody should be very concerned about, but high fructose corn syrup use increased dramatically. This is probably one of the worst things you can put in your body, high fructose corn syrup. And if you're not doing this now, please start reading labels, because whenever I pick up a food product that I don't know what's in it because I've already bought it before and researched it, I always read the label. And the minute I see high fructose corn syrup, I put that product back on the shelf, because there's no way I'm going to consume high fructose corn syrup. There's nothing good in it at all. It's worse than sugar. It's worse than, I can't even tell you how many things. But I would tell you, take a moment, pause the video, and go into your kitchen, and anything that you have that says high fructose corn syrup on it, throw it in the garbage and find a replacement for it, because it's one of the things that has really, I believe, contributed to obesity in America. It's dangerous. And then if we look at 2000, again, convenience foods and takeout became the staple. So again, comparing the old to the new, we stopped eating real whole foods and we started eating processed foods or convenience foods, and takeout became a staple. The other thing is portion size and caloric density of meals increased starting in 2000. So you can see that between 1980 and 2000, the average weight for a man went up 14 pounds, and the average weight for a woman went up, it looks like, about 9 pounds. Quite a bit of an increase in 30 years compared to the first 40 years. But, you can see what the reasons are that occurred. Now we get into 2010 and 2020, the last 2 years on our chart. And curiously, if you look, the average weight for men in 2010 was 199. The average weight for women was 170. And then 10 years later, the average weight for men was only 200, and the average weight for women was 171. So the average weight for men and women in the 10 years from 2010 to 2020 only went up 1 pound. Now, granted, we were already gigantic at 200 and 170, but the big question here is, what happened here? Because the trend line was crazy steep, and all of a sudden it flattened out right in the last 20 years. And so what are some of the things? Well, in 2010, these are actually things that contributed to, this particular weight, right? So they were still heavily reliant on ultra-processed foods in 2010, and a surge in screen time, smartphones, streaming, and gaming also contributed to, men and women getting up to these two numbers in 2010. But in 2020, it says weight gain appears to be plateauing. And some of the things that might be contributing factors in this are a rise in plant-based or low-carb foods and intermittent fasting trends. Also, an increased health awareness due to aging population and things like that. So, and again, plateau in recent decades, just some of the things that we might attribute that to are greater public health awareness, an increase in the fitness and wellness culture, and then policy shifts on food labeling and things like school lunch programs. So these are the characteristics that caused men and women in the United States to go from about 148 pounds for an average man and 128 pounds for an average woman in 1900 to 200 pounds for a man and 171 for a woman in 2020. I don't have to tell you, but 200 is too much and 171 is too much. We don't need that weigh that much on average. So my next question to ChatGPT was, well, here, it was this question right here. I said, what can we learn from the past to help us lose weight and maintain an ideal body weight today? Because I knew just from some of the bullet points on the slides I shared with you, there was a lot of information there that we could use to, to plan how we should live today. And so the first item that we came up with, and after I asked the question, was number one, whole unprocessed foods support healthy weight. Remember, from 1900 to 1930, there was hardly any weight gain at all, and the bullet points kept repeating to the fact that people were eating meals at home. They were making meals at home. They were eating whole food. There wasn't processed food back then, or very much of it, and there wasn't ultra-processed foods for sure. And so from 1900 to 1940s, again, they were centered on seasonal whole foods with minimal additives or preservatives. So what does that mean to us? If you want to lose weight and keep it off today, the advice would be avoid ultra-processed foods, high in refined sugars, seed oils, and additives. Emphasize single ingredient foods like vegetables, lean proteins like chicken, fruits, legumes, and healthy fats. And then cook more meals at home. Portion control improves and hidden calories decrease when we prepare more meals at home. So the second item that was recommended as a result of what we learned was movement. Again, if you recall, in the early part of this 120-year peak, physical labor was part of everyday life, whether through jobs, farming, walking, or manual chores. People back then moved more for a lot of different reasons. And so today we're encouraged to incorporate more natural movement, more walking, more standing, more biking, more gardening, more carrying groceries, anything we can do to just move like we moved when in the early 1900s. And then aim for non-exercise active thermogenesis, which is calories burned outside of a workout. So for example, if you do strength training 3 days a week, even after you've lifted weights for a half an hour, or whatever you did, your body is still, burning calories at a higher rate than it would be if you just were sitting on your butt all day. Number 3, portion size used to be smaller. So again, plates were smaller, servings were more modest, and snacking was very rare. So what does that mean for us today for trying to lose weight and keep it off? Use smaller plates. Measure portions and avoid supersized restaurant meals. Years ago, I stopped going out to eat lunch from work because, in fact, the serving sizes were getting so big that by the time I got back to my office, all I could do is, fall asleep and pass out. I'd need a nap because I was so full from all the food I ate. And it wasn't like I was ordering the giant version of something. I was eating at restaurants, not fast food places, and they just continued to increase the amount of food I was getting to the point where I just couldn't do it anymore. Also, practice mindful eating. Eat slowly, avoid distractions, and stop when you're roughly 80% full. Don't eat till you're, really full, which is something that we've all done. 4 is less frequent eating was normal. People typically ate 3 meals a day without constant snacking, and that's not so true today. So what are the recommendations today for us? Avoid grazing all day. Limit eating windows. I mean, consider intermittent fasting or time restricted eating. And an example of that would be maybe a 16-8 fast where you eat between 9 and 5 during the day. So 9 and 5. And then after 5 p.m. I don't eat again until the next morning at 9. And so that's an example of a 16-8 intermittent fast, which can be very effective for some people to help them lose weight and keep it off. And let hunger, not habit or boredom, guide your eating. Because of all the snacks that are available to us today, it has become super easy for us when we're sitting in front of the TV for God knows how many hours after dinner to just grab a bag of something that says it's healthy, while we're sitting there to just, because we're bored watching TV. So again, less frequent eating was normal back then. Maybe we should get back to that. Number 5, this is a really tough one. Sugar and ultra-processed carbs weren't ubiquitous. They weren't around, especially in the first 40 years. Sugar was a luxury. Soda and candy were occasional treats. And now, sugar's every day, and soda and candy for a lot of people is every day, especially people who are obese. So, cut back drastically on added sugar and sweetened beverages. And read food labels. I mean, I can't stress this enough. Please read food labels because, for me personally, one of the first things I look at is added sugar. And if there's added sugar, I still might consider it. But if the added sugar is a high fructose corn syrup, putting it back on the shelf, not going to touch it. So when I do use products that have added sugar, I really strive to find products where the added sugar is very, very, very low. Because if you eat 3 or 4 different processed food products in a day and they all have added sugar, and let's say there's maybe 6, 7, 8 grams of sugar in each one, call it 8. That's 32 grams of added sugar if I ate 4 of those in a day. That's more added sugar than I need. And at the end of the month, at the end of the year, I'm going to be a heavier person because I'm eating all that added sugar. And you can prevent this by simply reading labels. Number 6, food wasn't constantly marketed or engineered for addiction. And that is what is happening today. People didn't face this constant exposure to ads and hyper-palatable foods engineered for overconsumption. The food scientists at all the major food companies today are constantly trying to figure out how to make food such that people eat it faster. Because if people eat a bag of chips faster, they'll buy the next bag sooner. This is a fact. The food that you buy, the ultra packaged food, is being designed to get you to eat it faster because then you'll eat more and then you'll buy more. So be mindful of food environment. Keep trigger foods out of the house. For me, I got a sweet tooth that doesn't stop. And so I'm constantly trying to not bring sugar products into my house. And if my wife or my kids bring them into the house and I find them, I tend to eat them. And then they get mad at me and I say, I'm sorry, but if it's in the house, I'm going to eat it. I don't buy food, or sugar products to save them. I bring ice cream into my house because I want to eat ice cream. So what I'm trying to do is really keep those trigger foods for me out of the house. And I've been doing that for, roughly 13 years and managed to be able to keep my weight off and stay healthy. And so again, good advice, keep the trigger foods out of house and follow the out of sight, out of mind principle. Plan and shop with intention. Go to the store with a shopping list and stick to it. The more you do that, the less you're going to find a bunch of ultra processed foods in your cart, and the more you're going to find it's easier for you to lose weight and keep it off. Number 7, sleep and stress were less disrupted. So though life wasn't necessarily easier back in the first 40 years, they didn't have to deal with things like, as it says here, blue light, 24/7 news cycles, and screen addiction that impairs our sleep but didn't impair theirs. So for us, the recommendation here is prioritize 7 to 9 hours of sleep. Poor sleep leads to increased cravings and insulin resistance, and poor sleep can cause obesity, as much as any other reason, quite frankly. So it's really important to pay attention to your sleep. And then manage stress through nature, breath work, journaling, movement, anything you can do to manage your stress, because the better job you do at managing your stress, the easier it is to manage your weight. So pay attention to sleep and stress. And then number 8 is think of things as a lifestyle, not diet, if you're interested in long-term success. In other words, diets are for yo-yos, all right? Because everybody I know, including myself, have been on 2 or more diets. So they gain a bunch of weight, they go on a diet, they lose a bunch of weight, they're happy for a year or two, and then something happens and they gain the weight back, and then they whoops, go back on a diet, and then they lose it again, and then a couple of years they go, and it's a yo-yo diet. It doesn't work, and it's really unhealthy actually. And what they're suggesting here is, back then people didn't diet in a modern sense. They simply lived within their environment. They ate whole foods and they moved a lot. So aim for sustainable habits, not temporary restrictions. And this is why, any diet will help you lose weight in the short term, but every diet will fail you in the long term, because it's temporary restrictions that help you lose weight in the beginning. And these restrictions end up being more than people are willing to bear long term. So once we stop with the restrictions, the weight comes back, and here we are looking for another diet. And then finally, design your environment and identity to align with long-term health. Think of yourself as a person who moves daily and eats clean. Make that your self-image of yourself, and it will be easier for you to walk out of a grocery store without a cart full of ultra-processed food garbage. So wanted to just kind of summarize that for everybody so it's a little bit easier to consume, but basically how to apply the past today. Again, historical insight, whole foods diet, modern strategy, shop the perimeter of a grocery store and cook more meals at home. I mean, I think I've stressed this quite a few times on this video. Number 2, daily physical activity. Walk 8 to 10,000 steps a day. Stay active outside the gym. Again, just like our ancestors in the 1900 through 1930 or 1940, right? More movement, more whole food. Smaller and fewer meals. Eat 2 to 3 balanced meals a day, and really cut back on snacking. Again, if you're overweight or you're struggling to maintain weight, just check into your snacking. That might be an area of opportunity for you. Lower sugar intake. That's a historical insight. Avoid added sugars. Choose fiber-rich carbs. The next one, less processed foods. That's, again, the historical insight is less processed foods. And so read labels and try to eat minimally processed meals and foods, and avoid low sugar, again, as we mentioned up there, at all costs. Natural portion sizes, historical, and then use smaller plates and really stop eating when you're full. If you think about it, from 1910 to 1940, those were actually kind of tough times for a lot of people. I don't think people had like an abundance of food in their house. So I think there was probably a lot of meals for people back in those days when at the end of the meal, if you were still hungry, that's too bad. I mean, you got what you got today. That's all we had. So think about portion size. Built-in movement, historical insight, take the stairs, use walking meetings, anything you can do to add movement to your life, your daily life. And then finally, less exposure to food marketing. Control your food environment, plan ahead, and just stay focused on the self-image of you being a healthy person, a healthy, fit person, not just somebody who's a victim to marketing and advertising and, can't help but put all the ultra-processed foods in your cart. So there you have it, kind of a walk down memory lane. We looked at the average weight for men and women over the last 120 years. We noticed that they were quite a bit lighter way back in the beginning of that time. And we were able to identify some of the reasons we believe that they were able to be lighter. And again, just to say it again, eating real food, whole food, avoiding ultra processed foods, avoiding sugar and things like that, and then moving more, I think are the biggest takeaways for me from looking at this historical example of what happened to the weight of an average man and an average woman over the last 120 years. So I hope you like this video, and I hope you've got some things that you took out of here that can help you lose weight and keep it off. And look forward to seeing you again on another video. Thanks, and have a great day.